for all the comments and questions. And so trying to keep the time here, we'll move on to the next speaker, which is Annie Runkel. She will present a paper titled Boredom and Creative Constraints. Annie Runkel is an artist and poet, as well as a PhD candidate at Duncan of Jordan Stone College of Art and Design in Dundee, Scotland. Her PhD project investigates boredom through practice-based artistic research. It focuses particularly on boredom's connection to creativity and attention, and he is currently completing an SGSAH-funded artist residency at Deveron Projects in Huntly, Aberdeenshire, on the topic of boredom and town regeneration. She was shortlisted for the Scottish Book Trust's New Writers Award in 2017. Her creative work has been featured in performances, broadcasts, and exhibitions in Scotland and beyond. And as you know, you have 20 minutes, and we have another 10 minutes for questions after that. So please go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. A scary thing to follow after this keynote, I think, but yes, I'm very excited to be here. I'm not a psychologist, as you heard from the introduction, but I hope that my topic sort of fits in with what we've kind of heard about in the last few weeks. So I'm here to talk about constraint as a tool for creativity and what we might possibly learn from research about constraint, about the connection between boredom and creativity. So the talk is very much informed by my own experience as an artist and a poet. In my creative practice, I like working with constraints as sort of boundaries and frameworks for the imagination. So it was only natural for me to bring these two things together. So my research about boredom and the idea of constraint. So the idea that boredom can boost creativity is almost a truism in popular culture. There's countless articles and opinion pieces that talk about it. Particularly since the rise of the smartphone, I think there seems to be sort of nostalgic longing for boredom that captures a lot of people's imagination on that topic. But the idea that boredom and creativity are somehow linked is obviously nothing new. I think we've kind of heard about a lot of these thinkers already. So Søren Kierkegaard had very strong opinions about boredom, as we heard already. He considered it the root of all evil. But he also suggested that it might have actually been the source of creation itself. Then a few decades later, Friedrich Nietzsche seemed to consider boredom as conducive to the work of thinkers and other sensitive souls, no doubt thinking about romantic poets and painters. And then later in the early 20th century, Walter Benjamin also talked about boredom, comparing it to a warm grey fabric lined on the inside with the most lustrous and colourful of silks. So that idea kind of suggests a lively imagination that springs from the quiet tedium. So the notion that boredom may somehow lead to creativity seems to be a very appealing idea for many people, and not just today, but also way back then. The question is, can such a claim actually be substantiated? Is there evidence for this? So there are studies in psychology trying to answer that question. In particular, there have been two papers recently, or in the last few years at least, that have been looking at that question. So the first one by Sandy Mann and Rebecca Catman asked participants to complete boring activities, such as reading a telephone book. After this, they had to complete creative tasks. In this case, the participants were asked to come up with as many uses for a pair of takeaway cups as they possibly could. Compared with the control group, the participants in the boredom group came up with more ideas. There were also indications that their ideas tended to be a little bit more innovative. However, these results weren't quite as clear. So to put it in a nutshell, Mann and Catman's answer to the question whether boredom can increase creativity was kind of. So in a second study, almost exactly the same question was addressed. That was the study by Goyen Park and her co-investigators in 2019. Again, the participants first had to complete a boring task, obviously, and then they participated in creative activities. In this case, these included a product development task where they were asked to generate ideas for a tool to help dog owners clean up their dog's poop. So like Mann and Catman, Park and her colleagues had quite mixed results. So their first study found that the boring task actually did lead to more and also more unique ideas. Yet a second version of the study didn't quite find a significant connection between more or better ideas and boredom. So, and that's basically where the research on boredom and creativity leaves us. So there's quite a lot of anecdotal evidence and a few empirical studies whose results are not always very conclusive, I think. And I think this is also because creativity is actually quite complex. It relies on a diverse set of skills and attitudes. And the studies I've discussed so far used methods from creativity research, but they didn't really consider the creative process as a more, on a more detailed level, so to speak. What does creativity actually involve? So obviously there are countless definitions of creativity in the literature, but most authors seem to agree that novelty and originality must be a key feature of the results of creative endeavors. So in other words, creativity produces something new. But creativity should not only be about novelty for the sake of novelty, it must also be recognized as contributing something and must be understood by others as worthwhile. This may be, for example, because the results are useful, they solve a particular problem, or particularly in the case of the arts, the results are able to propel further development in their field. So this definition is obviously more focused on the results of creativity. What precedes these results is quite a wide range of mental processes. So I think to understand creativity and the way boredom affects it, it's quite important to consider all the various elements that go into the creative process. So in general, so it's a very simplified way of looking at generally, this obviously begins with identifying a problem. This could be an actual problem, something that prevents something else from working, but it also can be a deficiency, a gap in the knowledge, a missing element, or a disharmony. In the arts, a lot of the time, this would be something to do with trying to find a way of expressing a certain idea or feeling or reality. Next, it is necessary to identify where the difficulties and challenges come from, and then we move on to a search for a solution. So this might involve experimentation or the formulation of a hypothesis, which is then tested, modified, retested until a suitable solution is found. And then finally, the result has also to be communicated, for example, in an artwork or in a product. So, of course, you will notice this process is actually very similar to the process you will use yourself in research or indeed in any type of problem solving. But whereas in research, the steps in the process can take weeks or months or even years, the creative process, the steps are very rapid. Or they can be at least. So you might not even be aware of the different steps because you run through them so quickly. And sometimes they're even happening unconsciously. So it is actually within these different steps that the idea of constraint plays a role. So I will talk a little about constraint and its effect on creativity now in quite a bit of detail, as I think we can learn something from this about the relationship between boredom and creativity. So constraint, simply put, is a set of parameters that limit the total number of choices that are available to solve a problem. So constraints can take a lot of different forms and shapes. It could be something like working only with a particular medium or a particular technique. It can also be something like a time limit, for example, finishing a painting within a day. The Japanese artist Onkawara used the particular constraint of time constraint for his famous date paintings. One could argue that these paintings are one of the most extreme examples of constraint applied by an artist. So Onkawara followed a strict set of rules for each painting. So each shows the date on which the painting was executed on a solid background. And Onkawara worked on these date paintings, which came in a series over more than 40 years, creating 3,000 and more than that of these paintings in that particular style. Like Kawara, many artists and creatives consider constraint quite a powerful tool in their creative process, me included. It can offer sort of a starting point for a project, a cure against blank page anxiety, which I think even researchers know very well. It can also provide a framework or guide in the creative process. More radical constraints can also act as a deliberate roadblock or a forced diversion. They may help the artist from doing their work in the way that they usually would. Particularly, this last type of constraint is experienced as an aid in creativity. In her 2017 paper, Patricia Stokes explains this connection with reference to variability. Put simply, variability is the measure of how differently something is done. So when solving a problem, it is natural to first try or use a tried and tested approach. As they say, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. However, when novelty is what you're aiming for, tried and tested can actually get in the way. So it is very easy to get stuck in existing thought patterns and routine problem-solving approaches. These are likely to result in very reliable results, but usually not in very original ones. So this is where constraints can come in handy. They are able to interfere with the existing patterns and force new ways of doing and thinking. But not all constraints work in the same way or are as successful at supporting innovation. So while voluntary constraints, so those that are set by the individuals themselves, are generally seen as more positive, even generative, external constraints, so those created by external factors and other people, tend to be more ambiguous when it comes to their effect on creativity. In her 2015 paper on constraint and its effect on creativity, Marieke Ruskes considers the types of constraints people may experience in the workplace. So this may include time constraints and noise, having to manage multiple tasks at once, or being set very tight goal definitions by a supervisor. So all of these are very different types of constraints than the ones that I've previously talked about. They're all external constraints that are imposed by external factors and other people. Basically, they're the conditions or context in which creative work is carried out. So Ruskes observes that not all of these external constraints are detrimental for creative work. In fact, some can actually bolster creative performance. So to shed some light on this phenomenon, Ruskes distinguishes between two different types of external constraints. So she says there's limiting constraints and channeling constraints. This distinction is basically based on the constraint's effect on cognitive processes. So limiting constraints are defined as constraints that consume or occupy cognitive resources. Channeling constraints, in contrast, help people to effectively focus their resources by setting clear-cut goals or establishing frameworks in which people can work. Interestingly, even within these two categories, there's no hard and fast rule that makes one type more supportive of creative work than the other. So Ruskes' research revealed that the effect of the particular type of external constraint is also influenced by the type of motivation that drives the creative process. So Ruskes distinguishes between approach motivation, which is focused on achieving success and positive outcomes, and avoidance motivation, which is concerned with avoiding failure and negative consequences. I'm sure all the psychologists will be very aware of this distinction. So as this table shows, whether or not a constraint is conducive to creativity will depend on the combination of the type of constraint on the one side and the type of motivation that drives the process. So in some cases, the particular combination can boost creativity, and sometimes it will have exactly the opposite effect. So what this shows is that the relationship between constraint and creativity, the question whether a constraint is generative, hinges significantly on quite a number of different factors. So it's about whether or not someone chooses the constraint themselves, what motivates their work, and if they accept the constraint as a positive challenge. Even whether or not they have loads of other things to worry about at the time will have an impact. I think that's quite an obvious one as well. But now the question is, what does that tell us about the relationship between boredom and creativity that so many people believe in? So I think there are two possible avenues that can be pursued for the research on boredom and creativity. The first relates to an understanding of boredom as arising out of a type of constraint, and the second relates to boredom's relationship with motivation. So previous research considered quite a simple connection between boredom and its effect on creativity. Sometimes it appeared that boredom increased creativity and sometimes it didn't. Little attention was given to the wider context in which boredom arises. So I would say we generally get bored when we are stuck in an undesirable situation or place we cannot easily escape. In this sense, we could argue that boredom arises out of external constraints. If we stick to Rosker's distinction between limiting and channeling constraints, the majority of boring situations will be related to what she calls channeling constraints. Boring situations very rarely impose additional cognitive pressures. In contrast, boredom is often experienced as a sense of cognitive idleness or emptiness. As we have seen, channeling constraints can support creative thinking in certain instances and impede it in others. As a result, a boring situation will sometimes support creativity and sometimes it won't, just as previous studies and boredom research have found. So from the perspective of creativity research, there is a lot of evidence to support the hypothesis that constraints have an impact on creative thinking. So in this, if we believe, or if this is the case, and we also accept that boredom may arise from situations that are marked by external constraints, then it is suddenly less clear if the observed effect on creativity will be caused by boredom, or if the external constraint that are inherent to boring situations are the cause of that. So is this actually a case of causation, or maybe is it merely correlation between constraints and boredom? At this stage, I cannot offer a definite answer to this question, but I think further research on the connection between boredom and creativity would benefit from investigating this relationship between constraint and boredom further. The connection between boredom and constraint, however, is not the only angle that could warrant further investigation. As we have seen in Rosker's research, motivation is the other factor that influences creative thought processes. Interestingly, there seems to be also a close connection between boredom and motivation. So a lot of work in the field of boredom research acknowledges that boredom has significant motivational power. Like many types of negative experiences, it creates avoidance motivation. Yet, unlike pain or fear, it has less predictable action tendencies, and we've just talked about that. So instead of aiming for a decrease in stimulus which is present, it demands that we add a stimulus which is currently absent. So seen in this light, the effect of boredom could also lead to something akin to approach motivation. It pushes people towards something rather than merely away from something. So this type of motivation experienced is likely to be determined by the individual's experience or particular focus, either on avoidance of negative experiences or on striving towards positive experiences. Some interesting insights into this relationship between boredom and motivation and its impact on creativity have already been generated by the studies carried out by Park and her colleagues that we discussed earlier. As part of their research, their participants also filled out a survey to determine individual differences. This revealed that individuals with a high learning goal orientation, a high need for cognition, and a higher internal locus of control were more likely to benefit from boredom in a creative way. To me, it seems likely that people with these kind of characteristics are more likely to experience approach motivation in boring situations. But as we have seen, approach motivation alone does not guarantee an increase in creativity. It is the combination between types, specific types of motivation and types of constraint that determine if a situation or not is likely to support or impede creative thinking. So again, I have no definite research results to show here. Instead, I hope this presentation was able to maybe highlight some of the complexities in the relationship between boredom and creativity. I think more research definitely needs to be done in the field. And I think the role of constraint and also motivation might potentially be interesting starting points for this. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Annie. That was really, really fascinating. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, whether by chat or by raising one's hand. John Eastwood has raised his hand.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. And I was particularly interested in your thoughts about approach motivation and how that relates to working through boredom and coming out on the other end with something creative. And I think that's a fascinating idea to unpack. I mean, we certainly know that people who are prone to boredom seem to be more behaviorally inhibited. And so that's maybe an interesting tie-in for what you're saying. I wondered if you could comment on the role of creative ability to work with a constraint and a boredom to find oneself through to creativity. There was a paper that came out recently, I forget the author's name, but it was about novelty input, novelty output. If you follow up with me, I can send you that if you're interested, because it's very much on this. And they found kind of an important mediating role for creative ability in terms of how one responds to a boring situation. So I would just be curious to hear if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I would definitely say that it almost feels like if you have, I like to think of creativity almost like a toolbox. So you have a number of different sort of tools at your disposal in order to, deal with certain situations and be able to, come out at the other end with good ideas. So I think it definitely helps if you have sort of a routine or sort of a more experience in working creatively. Then you're maybe more able to overcome constraints. There's actually, as part of my PhD, I've done sort of a survey among creatives here in Scotland, sort of looking or asking them how they were dealing with boredom in the context of the pandemic, and sort of in general how boredom sort of plays a role in their creative practice. And one of the things that we're sort of coming through from a lot of these people, sort of also talking about the way that they work, there is a lot of, sort of people switching tasks and being able to combine things, periods of maybe doing less cognitively, what's the word? hard work, so to speak, in contrast to maybe easier and manual things. So I think that ability to sort of switch between tasks and sort of work your way kind of helps to be able to overcome constraints of any kind. Hopefully that answers the question.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thanks, John. Are there any other questions for Annie? Vinand.
Thank you for your fascinating talk. I think this link between boredom and creativity is one that as you say, is something that really needs to be further investigated, because there are surprisingly few studies on the topic at the moment, and there are some methodological issues with them too. I wonder so you identify essentially two paths, right? One is through the restrictions, and one is through motivation, that the boredom might be linked to creativity. I wonder if there's also space for a cognitive one. One aspect of creative thought is that people are engaged in divergent thinking, where they are able to transcend boundaries between, for example, different concepts in their minds, right? People be able to, for example, categorize objects in fewer categories because they're more inclusive in the properties they assign. And this divergent thinking is associated with greater creativity. Now, interestingly, boredom itself features or is correlated with mind wandering, right? And mind wandering has already been linked to creativity in a few more studies. So I wonder if there might be a possibility that the mind wandering that boredom triggers in people, that is associated with boredom in people, actually helps at a cognitive level in identifying more creative uses, for example, for objects, not necessarily out of a motivational process or to address a particular issue, but potentially even more spontaneously. So I was wondering if you think that would fit in your approach to the topic.
I think so, definitely. I mean, that idea of almost like the enjoyment of like linking things together and solving problems, I think is definitely an important part, and obviously then links to things like motivation, where like if you I think that was one of the things that came out of the second study, was to do with people who are what was the word, cognitive unfortunately forgot what it's called. So basically people who enjoy this kind of like cognitive and engagement, the like solving puzzles and things. And I think that's definitely also something that is true for a lot of creative people, definitely true for me. I love problem solving. So I think in that regard, I think there's definitely something to that as well, and it would fit very well in with the other things. Yeah. But yeah, as I said, I'm not a psychologist. I'm basically just absorbing all this information now, and hopefully be able to put something together, maybe with other people as well, who know more about the psychological side.
Okay, great. I think we have 2 or 3 more minutes, so Abel wants to ask a question.
Turn your microphone on, please.
Okay,
yes.
what about now? Okay. Sorry, I cannot even see my own screen. I think, Annie, you have said at the beginning that you're a poet. So my question is, what type of recommendation does follow from your reflection on boredom and creativity? We hear all the time that there is a correlation between boredom and drinking alcohol, between boredom and creativity, between all sorts of things, but we never know what to do with correlations. So my question is, what do you tell the little children or the not so little children regarding creativity? Are we supposed to create an atmosphere of boredom so that we can produce wonderful poetry? I suppose maybe that is not so simple, because if at the end the question is the problem solving issue, then we're all into that. We just need to generate the problem, the interesting one, and then of course look for a possible solution. So my question is very, very practical, Annie. What do you recommend us? And imagine us being as little as you want or as old as you want, that we're ready to create.
I would say probably boredom itself, I don't find very useful. Probably what I would say that is more useful is just quiet or spaces that allow you to you know, think about things. Those spaces of reflection. And obviously boredom can sometimes maybe open up spaces like that, where, you know, if you don't have anything else to do, and I don't know, your Netflix has run out or whatever, then you can finally sort of focus on other things and really you know, think about things, so to speak. But yes, I would definitely agree what you said earlier about there are just too many of these kind of I don't know, maybe myths out there that, you know, like you have to be I don't know, mental health issues, or you have to have an alcohol problem or whatever in order to be able to sort of really truly create. And I think that is also one of the problems that sort of surrounds a lot of the creative work and the arts in general, that idea that the art has a very separate sort of realm that, you know, you can't easily enter. It's definitely something that I feel, because I'm doing a practice-based PhD, so the creative work is part of my PhD, and you kind of stand in that point where people will say, well, but how is that research? And I think just looking at, like I had in the presentation, just looking at the creative process and seeing that it is so, you know, it kind of universal, also, you know, basically the same thing as other researchers do, I think remove some of that, you know, like mystical sphere that surrounds a lot of creative work. So I'm definitely in favor of saying, no, you don't need any of that special thing. You just, yeah, just do it.